Another really cool new feature of U8 is the new Strata filter, a numeric filter available in the function editor. So let's start out by bringing a procedural terrain into the scene, creating one. And we're going to edit the object, turn off the zero edges mode so that we can see the entire fractal. And I'm going to go ahead and edit the function and delete the seed node and change this over from a simple fractal to a terrain fractal, which is going to look a lot nicer. And I do want to use a world coordinate system, so I'm just going to click OK, the function editor, and under the mapping mode, change this over to world in the procedural tab. And I'm going to select no, I do not want any additional nodes added. And if you have any refresh problems, you can just change the scale. Okay, so go back into the function. Just right click, edit function, and I do want to switch this over to billows. And I'm going to go ahead and rearrange my interface so you'll be able to see a preview a little better. And I'm just going to make a few more modifications to the scale. I'm going to change metascale to 42, the largest feature to 12, and then change my wavelength to 3.4 on the X, Y, and Z, even though it really technically doesn't matter because the Z axis is null. But just in case I want to end up outputting this, I am going to match that Z scale. So go ahead and click OK. And we're just going to take a look at this really quick without the strata filter. And we can tell that the Z scale does need to be vastly increased. So just go ahead and scale this up a little. So I've just gone ahead and rendered out this terrain, made a few adjustments to the light, mainly just decreasing the shadow amount down to 85%, the density of the shadow. And I'm just using the default material for the moment, just so we can see the geometry a little bit better. So let's go ahead and stratify this terrain, quote unquote. Go ahead and edit the object, get back into the terrain editor, go back into the function. And what I want to do is select the link between the altitude output and the terrain fractal and add in a filter. It can be any filter at this point, but then what we can do is just change this over, and what you're going to notice is a new recursive section with the strata and the confined strata. First take a look at just the strata. And what this is going to do is create nice leveling of the terrain. And if we take a look in the node preview, what you're going to see is some different layer spacing happening to the terrain. You can ignore the Z because the Z output is not part of terrains, and only the X and Y are used. Some really straightforward tools for this. We can adjust the layer spacing, of course how hard the layers are going to be, and then go ahead and tone that down a bit. If you're getting way too much cutoff where it's going to be a completely flat area, then your hardness will need to be slightly turned down, and even still we can start to see a little bit too much flattening of the surface. So if we need to, we can turn down the thickness of the layers, and that'll help reduce that complete flattening of the surface. And if you pay attention to the node preview, you'll be able to get a little bit of a better idea of what's really going on. Another thing you could do if you want to have a higher thickness but still reduce that overall flattening is to reduce the processing strength, which is the overall application of the filter. So if you just want to start to bring back some of the detail, you can reduce the processing strength and start to get some of that detail back with still having a really larger overall thickness amount. And you can also smooth out the edges all the way around where the different layers are. I'm going to go ahead and zoom in so we can see this a little bit better. So with no smooth edges on, we can see these very sharp lines. So there's a huge cutoff. So what we can do is smooth that out a bit. We can still see a lot of that. Most of that won't show up in the render as harshly. It will be there. So if you need to, thickness and then also maybe hardness can help with the way that looks. You also have the option to adjust the heading and tilt, so being able to rotate around the filter. First, what I'm going to do is reset this back to the defaults. And a really easy way to reset any filter function, anything like that, without having to delete it and add a new one, is just to switch the filter and then change it back. And that will reset to the default, which is pretty nice. So let's just take a look with the default settings, modifying really quick. We take a look at the rotation. So we can adjust the tilt heading, which at the moment isn't really going to do much. So let's go ahead and increase the angle, change the heading, and then we can see it become applied. So the heading and the angle are connected, where you're really not going to see the direction change with heading unless you have an angle set. So this way you can create Stratify Terrain and have it more angled to slice that away. And then if you want to adjust the overall direction of that, you can use the tilt heading, and then it'll start to kind of tilt it in the other direction. So it can make for a really interesting combination between the two. So just triggering whether or not it's shifting, pitching, and then you can rotate that around to skew it even more. And you can do some really neat stuff with the overall rotation change. I do want to note that rotation does take a little bit longer to render or process, so depending on how complex your overall function is, anytime you use any sort of directional change that's using orientation, it will take a little bit longer because basically it has an internal node. I'm going to go ahead and just add in math node vector operation rotation and twist, and it's basically the same sort of rotation options. And anytime you use these to modify vectors, it does take a little bit longer to process, and especially if you have a really complex fractal. It's not always going to take an extremely long time to process, just when you have complex functions. So let's just take a look, just using the defaults, pretty straightforward, and take a look at the impact of the terrain. Now in this case, it has increased the gain output. So it has raised up the terrain, so if you need to scale it down, you can. But without making any scale changes, I'm going to go ahead and render this out. So with this being stretched out so much on the Z, we're seeing a lot of artifacts around the areas where it's such a harsh cutoff. And that's because the terrain is being pulled upward from a flattened set of geometry. So anytime you have a really steep slope on any terrain, it's going to have a little bit of tearing. Now, this does really help reduce that amount. So sometimes you can use just the strata filter on more of the harsher fall-offs in order to help reduce some of the artifacts. But in this case, what we want to do is, of course, scale this down because it just doesn't look right. Now, because of the type of terrain I'm using and some of the changes in View 8 with the terrains, the pivot point is a lot lower, and depending on the extension that's set up for the terrain, you may have to move the terrain up a lot higher than the pivot. We can see right now it's quite a ways below, and moving the pivot will not stay where it's moved to. It does move back. So if you are going to increase the scale a large amount, you might have difficulty adjusting the terrain from the main camera view using the gizmo. So we'll just go ahead and take a look at this from a slightly different angle. And just go ahead and scale that up just a little bit more. And render that out again. So that definitely looks much better. And if you really take a look around the diffuse areas and where the shadows are, it's really quite dark. And that's because of the really, really harsh changes to the geometry in those areas. Sometimes the diffusion is just going to get really thrown off. And in this case, I think it's a little too hard. And it's causing the lines to be, in my opinion, way too dark. Of course, the material will also take care of a lot of that. Plus, you could reduce processing strength. There's a lot of things you could do. If we go back to the material editor and pull up the function, or sorry, go back to the terrain editor and pull up the function for the procedural. And what I'm going to do is switch this over to the Confinement Strata. Basically, this is pretty much the same thing, except we have a couple of new options, which is the ability to set a height, basically a floor and a ceiling, to constrain the overall filter. So it's just within a certain range. You'll also notice that the origin amount is a vector rather than a number. And a lot of that has to do with the way the filter itself has to run, because the Z scale is just pretty much useless with the terrain. So it does become difficult to create these kind of an effect, or these kind of effects. So the strata filter itself does have restriction because of that, and especially in other uses, which we're going to take a look at in a sec. But what we can do now is set the overall amount, what to not go below. I'm going to go ahead and reset my scale. So we can set to not go below a certain distance, and also the height. So if we just wanted to do this to the central part of the terrain, we could just clip in these values. You may notice, because of the way this is running, kind of a sine wave type filter effect, where it's dipping down. So if you need to adjust the fade in, that'll help smooth that out. Also smoothing the edges and adding a little bit of plateau filling. If it's still a little bit too much, you might need to just increase the height amount, making sure it's not too close to the below or the floor value. And I'm also going to go ahead and reduce the hardness, which is really going to help remove some of that. And also paying attention to the node preview. And if you need to change the scale, that can help a little bit more. Sometimes you might have to turn off the auto extension. I'm going to set it to 0.5 so that it stretches a little bit more up and down. Because if it's not going above a certain amount, the auto extension caps off kind of at 1 as the minimum. So if you need to go a little bit lower, you could just type in a manual value and see what's going on a little bit better. So we can also increase the spacing between layers. And then if you need to, you can also increase that smallest feature size, which is going to help remove some of the really fine layers causing some of those artifacts we saw before. So that can be really beneficial. If we take a look now, we're going to see that rim increase the smallest feature, and it's going to really smooth it out. So if you want something a little bit smoother, that also helps along with the smooth edges, and that's pretty nice. I'm going to go ahead and reduce this fade amount, and then we can click OK, and then take a look at the overall terrain. And I also want to note that depending on if you have the with rotation option on for the terrain fractal, it will produce a different output for the strata filter. For the most part, what I've noticed with the terrain filter, or using a terrain fractal, is if you have the rotation turned off, you will get more harsh areas or peaks at the top of the terrain. And since we're using more of a confined strata, you're not going to see it as much. But there are some areas that are kind of peaking above. And that tends to happen a lot more when you have that rotation turned off. It's a little more obvious. It's kind of hard to see within just the function editor. But that's also more apparent with just the regular strata and not so much the confined strata. So now we can see, of course, most of those really fine lines are now gone, but we still have a nice impact on the terrain where it is creating these nice overall layers. It's just more of a smooth layer. Using this in combination with a blender, even connecting to itself, can also be really useful and create some pretty neat effects. So if we go back to the function, I'm going to go ahead and increase that overall impact. First, I'm going to change this back to just the regular strata, and that way we have a full impact over the entire terrain. Reduce the thickness amount. And what I'm going to do is create a blender node set to combiner node set to blender to start with, and then connect the input 1, which is the second input, to the altitude of the terrain fractal. So now we have both the original output, the altitude, and then also the strata filtered altitude. So if we take a look, one thing that's going to be important if we're going to be mixing this where we want it to be relatively the same, just kind of removing the strata area, is if we take a look at the output, we need to make sure they're fairly similar. So if you take a look with the extension, you can kind of see where the highest point is, and it is only really raising it a little. But what I'm going to do is add another filter, not using a strata, switch that over to the offset. And what we can do just is make a slight reduction or increase to get them to match a little bit better. Because of the gain amount, it's not going to be perfect, but I'm going to go ahead and just set this to 0.1, which is going to lift it up just a little bit more. Now, what we can use to control this blend is if we take the ratio, and if you're not showing the side outputs, if you go up to the top, show parameter connections, turn that on, and that way you can access all of these. Otherwise, you're going to have to click on these little lightning bolt looking things to extract the parameter. So if you extract it, it's going to give you a constant, which then you can replace. But what I'm going to do is drag this onto the terrain fractal and select the rough area output. So now we're still using the same fractal, just kind of combining it and changing it in different ways. So we will need to adjust the reference feature size of the terrain fractal. And what this is doing is pulling out some of the smoother areas and giving us a subtraction or a blend between the two different nodes. If you need to see a preview, because in this case it is a little difficult to tell scale, I'm going to go ahead and zoom out so we can see more of the terrain and connect the main altitude output over to that rough area. And that way we can really see what scale we're working with here. What we can also tell is our output amount. So what we're really looking for is a good distribution of these higher points and the lower points. And because we're falling below 0, I'm going to go back and connect this to the blender, and we're going to be able to see a little bit better where the subtraction is. One of the new options is to clip the ratio for the input. So anything being inputted is going to clip and cut out anything below 0, above 1. So if we clip this, it's going to make sure that the input is not getting reversed, so we're not going too far towards one of the inputs rather than the other. In other words, the blender itself uses a ratio value between 0 and 1 rather than -1 and 1, which is what most controls are and outputs in Vue. So the clip ratio allows you to work within that range and automatically fit pretty much any input to work better with the blender node. So if we want, we could also add another filter to this rough area where we can see the output. And that'll give us a little more control. Go ahead and set this to brightness and contrast. We can increase the contrast, reduce brightness. And the area we're looking at is between 0 and 1. Since it's clipped, anything that falls below we don't need to worry about. But now we can see some of the areas that are going to be affected by this rough area. And it's just going to create a blend between the stratified terrain and then the regular terrain. And then we could also set a mode. The blend itself is just either input 1 or input 0. But if you wanted to blend them together a little more, we could add one on top of the other. And now you can really see that separation based on the output and also because of the rough area itself. We can multiply it to give a fairly interesting look, but it might cut out a little bit too much. And then switch it over, just take a look at the max, which is also going to cut it out. For the most part, since we're controlling this blend with the rough area, it's going to work a little bit better just setting it to the blend mode. So either the main input, not really blending them together at all. We can really see that separation between the two. If we have to increase the size, I am going to go ahead and just make that reference feature size slightly larger so that it is not creating those very tiny peaks. And that looks a little bit better. So now we're going to have a nice mix between both the stratified areas of the terrain and also just the original terrain. We could use other fractals as well. It doesn't have to be, of course, the rough areas. But the simpler the function is, the quicker it's going to process, and since the terrain fractal is already running, there's no sense in bringing in another fractal, in this case where we have something we could easily use to manipulate it. So now I'm going to go ahead and stretch this out a little bit higher. Since we shouldn't have as much tearing because of that blend. We'll go ahead and take a look at a render. And I did just move the camera a little to see a little bit more of the terrain. What you can see is some of the different patches where the terrain is starting to remove the different layering that's applied to it. There's some nice larger sections in there as well. And this creates a nice weathered erosion because you still have a lot of the original features of the terrain along with the areas that are being cut away and applied with the filter. So we can create some pretty interesting looks. If we wanted to expand upon that or even replace using the rough areas, which might not always be the best idea for this type of subtraction, we could either use the rough area with an additional node or just connect to something else. I'm going to use just something very simple, adding in a noise node. I'm going to use the Perlin noise gradient, and we're going to connect to that and see how that's going to turn out. I do have to increase the scale, and then I just want to take a look at the overall range and just make sure we have enough subtraction. And if we go back to the blender and we turn off the clip ratio, we are going to see a little bit more towards different sides of the blend. I'm going to go ahead and just use a simple fractal. You can just select the noise, change it, and bring it over to a fractal instead. Change this to simple fractal. And this way we've got some built-in controls like a gain option to see this a little bit better. So if we start to move out, we're noticing a really huge intensity on some of the stratted areas. So if we go back, clip, now we're not going to notice nearly as much of that. But we are going to see a lot more of the mix being cut out. And that's mainly because of the gain, and it will cut out those higher values. So if you're working within 0 and 1, it's not a big deal. If you're going beyond it, you might not want to clip it out. So I'm just going to reduce the scale. We can take a look, add a little bit of the metascale. And I'm just going to turn down the roughness. If we reduce the roughness all the way down to 0, it's going to be pretty much just like a noise node, except with some extra controls, but it'll run pretty quickly. We want a little bit of roughness, not too much. Go ahead and click OK, and let's take a look at this. So this is definitely a lot more interesting, a lot more going on. Now, because I do have the gain much higher than 0 and 1, and because I'm not clipping it out, we have some really intensified areas that are creating some really interesting looking distortions within the terrain. There are a lot of sections that are a little too distorted, and most of that's caused by the roughness setting of the fractal, because I'm using a fractal instead of a noise. Also, if you're using that offset filter, you can raise up the output of the original unstratified terrain and get a little more of the detail out of it that way. And because it's still processing really only just that terrain and now just the other simple fractal, it does render a lot quicker than if you were to have two individual terrain filters or terrain nodes set up. Now here's a render where I just added a simple material, just 2 or 3 layers, basically just a rock for the bottom layer, and then using a slope environment constraint on the grass material on top of it, I was able to really pull out those lines. So it creates an interesting looking terrain. In this case, I would probably smooth out most of those lines. if I was to move on a little further with this and reduce the roughness. But I want to show you now the impact of this strata and how it can be used for materials, because it does work a lot differently. So I am going to continue to work with this terrain a little bit more, and then just reset the material, and we can take a look at a little further. What I'm going to do is just make a couple of modifications to the way this is being distributed. One thing I'm going to do is go to the terrain fractal itself, and I've already gone ahead and done this, and just change the roughness setting to 0.6. The default of 0.63 I think is a little too high, and you end up with some really rough areas a lot of the time. If we go over to the simple fractal, I'm also going to decrease the roughness and the gain amount lower than it was before. Maybe a slight modification to some of the other areas. I'm also going to select the link between the fractal and the blender, and I just go ahead and add in a brightness and contrast filter to get us within a better range. Kind of lift it up by raising the brightness and increase the contrast a little. And that way we don't have too much of the strata showing, but just enough. So I'm going to go ahead and select the terrain and right-click on the material preview and reset it. So that we're just working with a very basic material, just the color to start with. And just doing a quick preview render, we can see what it looks like. Very little strata areas showing up, mostly affecting larger parts of the terrain. So if we go into the material, and now I want to modify the color, and I'm just going to go ahead and load in a color map. And I'm going to start with a fairly obvious distribution, something where it will be easy to tell the difference between the color. So now we need to control this color, so I'm going to right-click, edit the function, and I do want to make sure that I'm previewing this as a terrain. It is set as my default to override, but it appears when you reset a material, it's not taken into account. So I'm going to go ahead and just make that change. We can go back and now create something similar to what we were working on before. So I'm just going to start with the fractal, increase roughness, go ahead and turn down the largest feature amount, and just take a look at the output in the node preview. Also keeping in mind that now the Z is going to be important. And I'm going to switch and just make sure that a mapping mode is set to world standard. And I do need to decrease the scale just a little. So we're going to change the wavelength to 0.5. And I'm not quite seeing enough of the green, so I am going to edit the color map and just take my central color and move it over a little, because it was about halfway before, so most of the distribution wasn't equal, or was equal. So now we just got two primary colors. And we'll just take a look at a quick preview render and see the distribution and the scale. Of course, for a terrain, now this would be some nice little bumpiness in the overall height. If we put the strata on, it would look as it did before. But now if we're going to use the strata filter, so we'll go ahead and switch out that default one, change it to the strata, and we're not going to notice nearly the kind of effect that we saw within the terrain editor. And that's because this primarily affects the X and the Y, and is designed specifically really for terrains as the way they're extruded from that original flat set of polygons. So when we use this for a material distribution, what we're going to see is more of a harsher contrast between color. We're not necessarily going to see the layers that we were seeing before. And now the filter becomes more useful for creating steps in between the color levels and adjusting them that way. If we did want to get some layers out of this, what we can do is use the fractal and reduce the Z scale if I bring it down to 0.1. Now, granted, we could do this without the strata and produce a similar effect, but it's going to be a lot smoother in between the color transitions. So if we do want to take advantage of some of these features, and we can still create a nice look and get a pretty neat distribution. So it's not that it's not useful at all for materials. It's just you have to understand exactly how it's working within the full vector. The look will also change between mapping modes. So if we switch this over to, let's say, World Parametric, now this is going to reduce the overall scale of the material. And it looks like we have a little bit too much green, so I am going to just modify the gain. And then we can go back into the strata and change maybe the thickness and layer spacing. And because the fractal is so large now in this mapping mode, it does stretch out a little further, looks a little better. If we were to get something a little closer to how it was looking before, we could type in a value of 0.05 for the material. But we're still going to see a much better layering effect when using the parametric mode. And it wouldn't really matter if you're using the world or object parametric mode. It should give it just about the same result either way. It's just whether or not you're moving through the surface. And if we go back to the function and set that scale back to 0.5, the original scale, so that's equal on X, Y, and Z, you're still going to see a better effect with parametric mode. And now it does look a little more like the layers rather than the world mode. Because the parametric mode will basically automatically kind of stretch things down. Unless you have a really, really large terrain scaled on the Z-axis. So it's useful for a lot of different parts of materials. I've rather liked using it for alphas. So let's go ahead and just set something up. I'm going to add a layer underneath. We'll go ahead and just grab large scale rock, move it down, and I'm going to go ahead and just replace, and we can customize this a little more. Replace this with one of my grass materials. And then just take a look at the scale, which is rather large for the rock. And I'll go ahead and reduce the grass scale. And I'm going to take the alpha boost, set it to 0. Edit the function. And now I do have some influence of environment on here. So that is going to disrupt the preview. So I just want to make sure I open this up all the way, slope and altitude. Make sure there's no fuzziness or fall off options. and just control this with the alpha. So I'm going to use a fractal. Using a simple fractal, use Perlin noise, terrain Perlin noise. Set the wavelength to 3, largest feature to 10, metascale 42. Decrease roughness to 0.6, increase gain. Connect the alpha to the altitude, and then take a look as well and see the output. Also going to take that wavelength. Let's just use a value of 0.5 instead of 3. And I am going to actually bring that gain down because I'm going to use something else to clip it out once we've filtered it. So we'll go into select the filter, recursive, strata, increase the hardness a little plateau filling. And then after that, we'll take a look at the output, and we are going to need a value of -1. And the strata is pretty much clipping everything out at 0. So I'm going to add in another filter, set it to the smooth threshold. The low value is going to be 0. Or actually, I will need to take that low value and bring it down to -1 so that the output is correct. Take the threshold and bring it up to 0.5, which should start to clip this out a little bit better. And we can adjust a transition amount, which is going to be kind of a smoothing and a blending between the surfaces. And I just might need to change that scale. It looks like maybe it's a little large. We'll turn on with rotation for now, which will also impact the way the strata turns out. Bring largest feature down to 3 and the metascale to 12. Actually, I'll go back to that wavelength and just reduce it 0.2. Now, we're not really seeing the kind of effect we had before, and that's because this material is a world standard mapping mode. But rather than losing the existing distribution for the rest of the material, I'm instead going to add in input node position options. This will allow me to set up a different vector for the rest of the node or anything I want to connect to it, and I'm going to set this to world parametric and then connect the fractal to that. So now only the alpha is being affected by that parametric mode. And we can start to see that distribution showing. Probably need to change the scale, modify the gain, because it's not necessarily going to show the correct scale within the output observer. Just because the rest of the main material is set to a different mapping mode. So one thing I do is just get rid of metascale. That's one option. You will lose some of the variation. So I'll go ahead and bring that back up. And we could just adjust the gain to get it to show up a little bit better. Have more of the rock underneath showing through. So rather than having to go jumping back and forth, I'm going to use one of the new features, which is being able to adjust the alpha just within the material editor. So let's just change the function scale. And that'll give us a much better look. So it's a neat way to distribute materials to get a harsher cutoff and harsher contrast, along with some of the different mixes and internal functions built in to the strata. For the most part, it works best with procedural terrains. So the only thing I'd really want to do to improve this, because of course it doesn't look all that great, is going back into the smooth threshold and just increasing the transition. If I decrease, it's going to make the cutoff even worse. But because the gain output is so high from our other fractal, I do want to increase transition a little higher. Let's go ahead and bring it up to a value of 3.5. And that's going to give us a really smoothed out distribution with patches showing through. And that can look pretty neat. I can also tie the bump output to this. Keeping in mind that the scale is different. So go ahead and take the bump and connect it to the smooth threshold. And that output will need to match the alpha, which is 0.1, if I want it to match. It doesn't have to. Let's go ahead and render that out a little better quality and just take a look. And now looking at that with the bump applied to it, you can see much harsher lines and some of the layers starting to show up that way. In this case, I probably should use a separate connection or a separate threshold filter to the bump in order to get the gradient to be a little bit better. Because what's happening is the material is being cut off when the bump is at basically the wrong part, because working with alpha and height is different. So really using the opposite filter in between the bump would produce the grass going outward rather than inward. But as you can see, the strata filter is very versatile and can be used in a lot of different parts of the application. But you'll probably find it more useful for creating procedural terrains than anything else.